At 12:38 a.m., Dhafra Air Base in Abu Dhabi sat in the desert darkness 40 miles south of the UAE capital, its flight line carrying an aircraft concentration that had not existed at this installation since the Cold War. The base was the forward hub for American air operations across the Southern Gulf Theater, home to the 381st Air Expeditionary Wing, the E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft, whose orbits maintained the theater air picture 24 hours a day, the KC-135 and KC-10 tanker fleet that kept American aircraft aloft over Iran across engagements measured in hours, and, most significantly, the most concentrated single assembly of F-35A Lightning II fifth-generation fighters in any theater outside the continental United States. 54 F-35. As across 3 expeditionary squadrons, their low observable airframes, their sensor fusion systems, and their precision weapons loads representing the sharpest edge of American tactical air power in the region. The aircraft that had been flying the most dangerous suppression of enemy air defense missions into defended Iranian airspace, the aircraft that had prosecuted the highest priority target sets requiring the penetration of surviving Iranian air defense, the aircraft that had been, in the assessment of every IRGC Aerospace Force operational planner who had studied the campaign's execution, the single most important capability enabling the destruction of Iranian military infrastructure. The aircraft that, if destroyed on the ground or grounded for any extended period, would reduce American air campaign capacity against defended targets more than any other single action the IRGC could take. Dhafra had been at the top of the IRGC's targeting priority list since the 3rd day of Operation Epic Fury. Getting to it was the problem. The base was 640 miles from the nearest IRGC launch complex, beyond the effective range of the Fateh and Zulfagar families that the IRGC had been using against nearer targets. Reaching Dhafra required the IRGC's longest-ranged ballistic missiles, the Sejjil 2 solid-fueled medium-range system and the Emad liquid-fueled medium-range missile, and a cruise missile element that could fly a sea-skimming profile below the radar horizon of the Patriot and THAAD coverage that defended the base. The IRGC's targeting staff had spent 3 weeks after the conflict began working the problem of how to attack a target at the edge of their practical range, with sufficient weapon density to overcome the defensive architecture that was known to be protecting it. The answer they had developed used their most capable and most expensive weapons: 14 Sejjil 2 solid-fueled medium-range ballistic missiles, 11 Emad liquid-fueled medium-range missiles, and 18 Quds 3 sea-skimming cruise missiles that would fly a route over the lower Gulf, hugging the surface below radar detection height, arriving from the southwest, while the ballistic missiles came from the northeast. 43 weapons. All of them the most capable systems in the IRGC Aerospace Force's remaining inventory. The Sejjil 2's range of 2,000 kilometers and its solid fuel design, no propellant loading, minutes to launch, made it the weapon whose employment had been withheld specifically because its use would reveal the remaining launch infrastructure associated with the Sejjil program to American targeting systems. The decision to employ it against Dhafra represented, in the IRGC's assessment, the correct trade. The F-35A Fleet that would be destroyed or grounded was worth more than the launch infrastructure that would be exposed and subsequently targeted. The calculation had been made at the strategic command level. Mojtaba Khamenei had approved the strike authorization personally. At 12:38 a.m. and 4 seconds, the Space Force infrared constellation registered 11 simultaneous ignition events at the Sejjil launch complex north of Isfahan, the thermal signatures of 11 solid fuel motors lighting within a 16-second window, their plumes rising vertically before the missile's guidance systems tipped them onto their attack trajectories. 3 additional Sejjil launches followed from a dispersed position 40 miles to the northwest at 12:38 a.m. and 22 seconds. The Emad launches, requiring their liquid fuel loading cycle, had begun 4 hours earlier at 8:41 p.m. and had been monitored by Space Force since the thermal signature of nitrogen tetroxide oxidizer loading had appeared at the Shahrud launch complex. The Emad missiles had been on the tracking picture since 9:17 p.m., their positions precisely known, their launch expected somewhere in a 3-hour window that began at midnight. The Quds 3 launches came from 3 coastal sites north of Jask at 12:53 a.m., 15 minutes after the ballistic missiles, their sea-skimming profiles activating within 90 seconds of launch as the guidance systems settled into their wave-top flight envelopes. The warning reached Al-Dhafra at 12:38 a.m. and 19 seconds, 15 seconds after the first Sejjil ignition. The base's protective posture protocol activated within 4 seconds. 2 minutes earlier, at 12:36 a.m., the duty officer at the 381st Air Expeditionary Wings Operations Center had received a preliminary alert from the Space Force Fusion Cell at Al-Udeid, flagging the Emad launch complex at Shahrud as showing final pre-launch thermal signatures. The duty officer had immediately called the base commander. The base commander had activated the emergency aircraft dispersal order at 12:37 a.m. At 12:38 a.m. and 19 seconds, when the full missile launch alert arrived, 31 of the 54 F-35As had already been taxied to dispersal positions or had engines starting. 23 remained in their hardened shelters. The dispersal order had been running for 1 minute and 19 seconds. The Sejjil 2's time of flight to Al-Dhafra from the Isfahan complex was 11 minutes and 40 seconds at the trajectory the guidance was programmed to fly. 11 minutes and 40 seconds from launch to impact. From the Space Force warning at 12:38 a.m. and 19 seconds to the first Sejjil terminal phase arrival, approximately 11 minutes and 21 seconds. The defensive architecture had 11 minutes and 21 seconds to engage 14 Sejjil 2 missiles with maneuvering re-entry vehicles at a range from the launch complex that stretched the engagement geometry of every system in the theater. The THAAD battery positioned at Al-Dhafra's eastern defensive sector, one of 2 THAAD batteries assigned to the base's protection, the second positioned southwest to address the Quds 3 sea-skimming approach, had the best engagement geometry against the Sejjil 2's approach from the northeast. The THAAD's engagement envelope at this range and trajectory was not its optimal geometry. The Sejjil 2, coming in at medium range on a depressed trajectory optimized for delivery time rather than altitude, presented a re-entry profile that compressed the THAAD's terminal engagement window compared to the longer-range ballistic threats the system was designed around. The battery's fire control system began tracking the Sejjil 2 cluster at 12:43 a.m. as the missiles entered the upper engagement range, computed intercept solutions under the compressed timeline, and fired its first engagement at 12:44 a.m. and 7 seconds. The THAAD kill vehicles were optimizing their intercept geometry in real time as the Sejjil 2's maneuvering re-entry vehicles executed their own terminal adjustments, a dynamic engagement problem at the upper edge of the system's performance envelope. 8 of the 14 Sejjil 2 missiles were intercepted in the terminal phase between 12:44 a.m. and 12:49 a.m. 6 survived the THAAD engagement layer. The THAAD battery had fired 12 kill vehicles in 11 engagements, 2 per target for the 4 highest maneuverability threats, and the combined effect of the firing tempo and the compressed engagement timeline had placed the battery at the edge of its performance parameters. The battery commander would note in his post-engagement report that 2 of the missed intercepts had occurred when the Sejjil's terminal maneuver was faster than the targeting solution update rate had projected. The system had performed. It had not performed perfectly. It had not been designed to perform perfectly against a solid-fuel medium-range ballistic missile at this range on this trajectory. It had been designed to do what it did: intercept 8 of 14 and pass the remaining 6 to the next engagement layer, The Patriot PAC-3 MSE batteries at Al-Dhafra, 4 batteries in a defensive arrangement around the base perimeter that had been configured specifically for the long-range ballistic missile threat, took the 6 Sejjil survivors. The shoot-shoot doctrine committed 2 PAC-3 MSE interceptors per surviving Sejjil, 12 interceptors for 6 targets. The engagements ran from 12:49 a.m. to 12:50 a.m. in 44 seconds, 94 seconds of rapid-fire intercept attempts against 6 maneuvering re-entry vehicles in their final descent. 4 intercepts confirmed. 2 missiles survived to impact. The first Sejjil-2 that penetrated the full defensive architecture impacted the Al-Dhafra flight line at 12:51 a.m. Its penetrating warhead struck the surface of hardened aircraft shelter complex Bravo, specifically the taxiway apron connecting the shelter row to the main runway, and detonated on contact. The crater in the apron was 12 meters across and 3 meters deep. 3 F-35A aircraft that had been taxiing toward the main runway for dispersal at the time of impact were within the warhead's lethal fragmentation radius. All 3 sustained damage to their airframes from the blast and fragmentation pattern. Post-damage assessment would determine 2 of the 3 repairable within 22 days. The third sustained damage to its empennage and landing gear sufficient to ground it pending depot-level repair. The crater in the apron was assessed as blocking the taxiway for approximately 18 hours. The second Sejjil-2 impacted at 12:51 a.m. and 9 seconds, 8 seconds after the first, striking the open aircraft parking area designated Ramp Charlie, the same parking area where 21 F-35As had been repositioned during the dispersal order. The warhead detonated on the concrete surface at the geometric center of the ramp. The aircraft on Ramp Charlie had been dispersed across the ramp's full extent, the dispersal geometry maximizing the spacing between individual aircraft to reduce the multi-aircraft kill probability of exactly this kind of area impact. The spacing had been set according to the base's standard dispersal doctrine. The Sejjil-2's warhead lethal radius against parked aircraft on an open ramp was 34 meters. The minimum aircraft spacing in the dispersal arrangement was 40 meters. 5 aircraft on the dispersal ramp were within 45 meters of the impact point, inside the fragmentation hazard zone for aircraft systems and avionics, if not within the hard kill radius. Post-damage assessment confirmed 2 aircraft with avionics and sensor system damage requiring depot evaluation. 2 with minor airframe fragment damage, assessed as repairable within 14 days, and 1 aircraft positioned at 38 meters from the impact that sustained landing gear actuator damage, requiring field-level repair over 48 hours. 14 aircraft on Ramp Charlie beyond 45 meters from the impact were undamaged. 11 Emad missiles had followed the Sejjil-2 salvo. The Emad's liquid fuel propulsion gave it a longer time of flight than the solid fuel Sejjil from the same range, and the Shahrud launch complex added additional distance. The 11 Emad missiles arrived in their terminal phase beginning at 12:53 a.m., 4 minutes after the first Sejjil impact, while the post-impact assessment was still being compiled and before the Qud's 3 sea-skimming element had arrived. The Emad had been extensively analyzed in the Night Watch intelligence program, and the PAC-3 MSE batteries had been pre-briefed on the specific maneuvering algorithm used by the Emad's terminal guidance. The briefing had produced a modified engagement timing protocol designed to lead the Emad's maneuver rather than react to it. The protocol was an update of the same approach the Patriot crews in the Gulf had developed against the Emad during previous engagements, adapted for the Al-Dhafra engagement geometry, which differed from the Gulf engagements in approach, azimuth, and range. 8 of the 11 Emad missiles were intercepted by PAC-3 MSE between 12:53 a.m. and 12:55 a.m. in 30 seconds. 3 survived the Patriot engagement. The THAAD battery had already expended a significant fraction of its reload inventory against the Sejjil engagement and was operating on its reserve cells. The battery engaged all 3 Emad survivors with reserve THAAD cells. 2 were intercepted. 1, the trailing Emad, the one that had benefited from the engagement tempo having committed the THAAD's resources to the 2 leading missiles, survived to impact. The third impact on Al Dhafra occurred at 12:56 a.m. when the surviving Emad struck the KC-135 tanker parking area on the base's northern ramp. 2 KC-135s in their parking positions were within the warhead's lethal radius. Both sustained severe structural damage. Post-damage assessment would classify both as total losses of asset, aircraft that would never fly again. 3 additional KC-135s on the ramp outside the lethal radius sustained blast damage varying from minor airframe deformation on the nearest to negligible effects on the farthest. The loss of 2 KC-135s from the tanker fleet was the most operationally significant physical damage the strike achieved. The tanker fleet was not the intended target of the Al Dhafra strike. The intended target was the F-35A Fleet, and the Emad that struck the tanker ramp had been aimed at the hardened shelter complex 1,000 meters to the south. The guidance had drifted. The impact was not where the IRGC's targeting intended. The Quds 3 sea-skimming element arrived from the southwest at 1:04 a.m., 26 minutes after the first Sejjil launch, having flown their low-altitude route across the lower Gulf while the ballistic missile engagements were running. 18 sea-skimming cruise missiles, their wave-top profiles having kept them below the Patriot radar's detection horizon for most of their flight, appeared on the southern THAAD battery's surface search radar at 13 miles. The THAAD in surface mode, using its radar for surface track acquisition rather than its primary exo-atmospheric role, had been specifically tasked to watch the southern approach corridor for the Quds 3 threat that the intelligence assessment had predicted. The USS Monterey, repositioned to a position 24 miles southwest of the base 3 days earlier, specifically for this defensive function, contributed its Aegis radar picture to the engagement from a surface position that gave it a low-angle detection advantage against sea-skimming targets. Between the THAAD surface search, the Monterey's SPY-1B, and the Patriot MPQ-65 batteries, whose radar had been brought to its lowest elevation scan mode to maximize sea skimmer coverage, the Quds 3 element was tracked at 13 miles and assigned to Patriot and ESSM engagement solutions beginning at 1:04 a.m. and 12 seconds. 14 of the 18 Quds 3 were intercepted between 1:04 a.m. and 1:06 a.m. 4 survived. 3 were engaged by the USS Monterey SM-2 in terminal defense mode at close range. 2 were destroyed. 1 impacted the base's outer perimeter blast wall at 1:07 a.m. and destroyed a 40-meter section. The debris field from the impact damaged a perimeter guard post, unoccupied, its personnel having been moved to hardened shelter at 12:38 a.m. 43 weapons launched, 38 neutralized, 5 impacts. The F-35A Fleet. 3 aircraft damaged, 2 repairable within 22 days, 1 requiring depot-level evaluation. The tanker fleet. 2 KC-135's total losses of asset. The runway and taxiway closed for portions of the runway complex for 18 hours. A perimeter wall section collapsed. Every hardened aircraft shelter on the base was intact. 38 F-35. A's that had been dispersed or hangared were undamaged. 14 of the 19 F-35As on Ramp Charlie were undamaged. The 381st Air Expeditionary Wing was operating at reduced but sustained capacity within 4 hours of the last impact. The response was designated Operation JADE HAMMER. The targeting package for JADE HAMMER had 2 tiers. The first tier was the Sejjil and Emad launch infrastructure itself, the Sejjil complex north of Isfahan, the Shahrud Emad complex, and the dispersed mobile Emad launcher positions that Space Force had tracked since their departure from the Shahrud facilities 6 days earlier. The second tier was the production and propellant infrastructure that sustained the medium-range missile programs, the facilities that had manufactured the Sejjil 2 and Emad missiles expended in the strike, whose reconstruction or resupply would be necessary before the IRGC could mount a comparable strike against Al-Dhafra again. The B-2A Spirit bombers assigned to the first tier had been airborne since 11 p.m., pre-positioned on a mission profile that had them over the Persian Gulf when the Sejjil launches were detected. They carried GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators for the Isfahan complex's hardened underground missile storage and preparation tunnels, and GBU-31 JADE bombs for the Shahrud complex's above-ground infrastructure. The B-2s reached their weapons release points at 1:31 a.m. The GBU-57 assigned to the Isfahan complex's primary preparation tunnel impacted at 1:32 a.m. The seismic signature registered 2.8 magnitude. The second GBU-57, following the progressive defeat sequence at 1:32 a.m. and 40 seconds, registered 3.0 magnitude, the deepest penetrating strike at the Isfahan complex. The Shahrud complex received 4 GBU-31 impacts at 1:34 a.m. The propellant storage and launch preparation buildings were assessed as non-recoverable structural damage. The 44 F-35As from the 421st and 494th Expeditionary Fighter Squadrons, Al-Dhafra's own organic aircraft, the ones the IRGC had just tried to destroy, had launched beginning at 1:22 a.m., 26 minutes after the last impact on their base. Their pilots briefed on the JADE HAMMER target assignments before they strapped in. They flew the strike mission against the IRGC Aerospace Force medium-range missile command infrastructure and the production facilities for the Emad's liquid fuel propellant, the nitrogen tetroxide production plant at Parchin, and the undamaged synthesis facility at Shahrud. The aircraft that the IRGC had tried to remove from the battlefield had launched from the base that had just been struck, had flown into Iranian airspace, and had addressed the capability that had just attempted to destroy them. The GBU-39 and GBU-31 bombs from those aircraft impacted the Parchin propellant facility and the Shahrud synthesis plant beginning at 2:04 a.m. and running through 2:19 a.m. Both facilities were assessed as non-recoverable. The IRGC's medium-range liquid fuel missile program would require foreign-sourced propellant feedstocks to reconstitute, feedstocks whose supply was increasingly restricted by the international pressure campaign that had been running since the first week of the conflict. At 2:31 a.m., the post-strike preliminary assessment was transmitted from the JADE HAMMER operations cell. The assessment covered 43 Iranian weapons, 5 confirmed impacts, 38 intercepts, and operational damage to the Al-Dhafra complex that was assessed as significant, repairable, and insufficient to achieve the IRGC's targeting objective. The F-35A Fleet at Al-Dhafra had been reduced from 54 aircraft to 49 fully mission-capable aircraft in the immediate aftermath, with the potential for several of the damaged aircraft to return to flight status within 22 days. The tanker fleet had lost 2 KC-135s, a painful loss that the theater logistics chain would absorb through the repositioning of tanker assets from other locations. The IRGC had expended their most capable and most expensive medium-range ballistic missiles, revealed and then lost the Sejjil launch infrastructure that had been carefully protected throughout the campaign, and had achieved the destruction of 2 tankers and the temporary grounding of 3 fighters. On Ramp Charlie at Al-Dhafra, the aircraft that had been dispersed during the strike were being returned to their assigned positions. The crew chiefs were completing their post-dispersal inspections, checking airframes and systems, making the determinations about flight readiness that would set the schedule for the next day's sorties. The base was not back to full operational capacity. The runway section was still under repair. 2 shelters in the Bravo complex were being assessed by the engineering team, and the tanker ramp still had the wreckage of 2 KC-135s being surveyed by the accident investigation team. but the base was operational. The aircraft were being prepared. The sorties were being planned. At 3:15 a.m., the first F-35A to complete its post-dispersal inspection and return to service check taxied from Ramp Charlie toward the active runway section, its pilot following the tower's guidance for the cleared movement path around the apron crater that had been positioned with temporary lighting marking the obstacle. The aircraft crossed the marking, turned onto the runway threshold, and lined up on the center line. The sortie had been scheduled for 3:30 a.m. The pilot was early. The runway at Al Dhafra was open. The F-35As were flying. The IRGC had spent their finest weapons to close the base that had been striking Iran every day of the conflict. The base was still striking Iran. There is a specific kind of answer that requires no words and no announcement. It is the sound of a fifth-generation fighter's engine accelerating down a runway at 3 in the morning, 18 hours after the largest missile attack ever directed at that runway. The engine noise carries for miles across the desert. Across the Gulf, it carries farther than that.